Hi, my name is Brian Smith and I'm the Executive Officer of the Local Community Services Association. This is the peak body for neighbourhood and community centres in New South Wales. And with me today is Rich Harwood, the President and Founder of the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation. Rich, welcome to Australia.
Good to be here, mate.
Wonderful. Rich, you founded the Institute when you were 27.
Mm-hmm.
Why? What inspired you to, at that age, which is a relatively young age, to take this massive step?
Yeah, it seems particularly young now that it's 27 years later. I think it was a combination of factors for me. You know, I had worked for some NGOs and I felt as though their missions were admirable, but we weren't really getting at the tough issues that communities faced. As we often say in our own office, they were afraid to get their fingernails dirty. And, you know, I'd worked on, by the time I was 23 years old, I'd worked on 20 political campaigns in the U.S., the last one a U.S. presidential race. And, you know, many of the candidates that I worked for were good and decent people, but the campaigns were not. They were about striking fear into people's hearts, about dividing us, about pushing people into corners, about being acrimonious and divisive, and in many cases telling untruths about their opponents. And I felt as though that was holding us back. And then, you know, there was a third factor for me, which is I had serious illness when I was a child, and I learned after spending many years in hospitals and in hospital beds about what it means to feel invisible, to not be seen and heard, to lose your voice, to lose hope. And, you know, but for some people I met along the way, some coaches and teachers who made sure that I didn't fall through the cracks and they lifted me up, you know, that was in part one of my first experiences that community actually is a common enterprise. And that, but for our ability to come together around people, to create a sense of purpose about what we're trying to do, like these coaches and teachers did, I don't know quite how my life would have turned out. So, you know, it's a combination of all those things plus my faith that propelled me to do this. And yeah, when I was looking back now, 27 seems awfully young, but at the time I was really driven to do this.
That's a great story just in itself. You spoke about that personal experience of being excluded, of not having a voice. And I think in Australia today, there are a lot of people who have that experience. And our political system has, to a degree, almost encouraged people to think of their voice as being voting at the election, whether it's a general election or a state election or a local election. And that's democracy. How do we bring the voices of those who are not even used to feeling they have a voice into play?
Well, you know, it's amazing when, you know, after doing this for almost 30 years now, I still find this experience amazing when I go to communities and work with communities where people have felt excluded, where they have felt pushed out of the public square, in a sense, of where they believe that they can't make a difference by joining with other people. And the thing I always say to folks is, you know, the minute we ask someone, what are your aspirations for your community and your life, people become animated. They start to sit up in their chair, and what you discover is that no matter someone's station in life, no matter the color of their skin, no matter what side of town they live on, no matter how much money they have in their wallet, no matter whether they have one parent, two parent, or no parents at home, they have a situation where maybe they have a guardian, that we each are trying to create something in our lives, that we each are trying to move forward in some way, that we are each trying to fulfill our innate potential. And I think sometimes those in power, whether they're elected officials or in NGOs or in faith-based groups, sometimes we forget that. But the fact is that when you ask people the right question, it's all there to be heard.
You take the aspirations of people and encourage them to share with each other their aspirations. You create conversations, but those conversations are not romantic, are they? There's a hard edge to community conversations.
Yeah, I've worked in many communities that, in Michigan, in Detroit or Flint, Michigan, which folks in Australia will know is sort of the home of our auto industry. And in Flint, when we started to work in that community, they had lost tens of thousands of jobs. People were angry, they were frustrated, they felt betrayed. And there was nothing easy about those conversations. What became important was to pivot pretty quickly into people's aspirations so that we didn't just wallow in our sense of despair and our sense that we couldn't move forward. But again, what's interesting is even at the moment where people believe they don't have a role to play, they believe that they're isolated, they believe that they're wondering whether or not anyone cares about their future and what's happening. When people come together and start to talk about their aspirations, all of a sudden around the table or around the room, what people discover is, I thought I was all alone, and I'm hearing that we actually do share certain things in common, not everything. But as you know, Brian, we don't have to share everything in common to get started. All we need to do is figure out what we can agree on, where we believe something is valuable to work on, where we believe we have some assets to apply to those challenges. And before you know it, if we can start to take the first step and get the ball rolling, our confidence increases, our sense of belief expands, and then we're able to take on the harder and harder issues.
The sense of belief is very important, isn't it? And you've encountered communities that, in a sense, have lost belief in themselves. Would you like to share a little bit about your experience in that and how communities can regain that sense that they can do something?
Well, yeah, I think let me first say what we often do that I think deepens people's sense of disbelief, because I think that's as important as what actually engenders belief. A lot of times we think, those of us who are doing this work think that, when there's a sense of disbelief, a sense of a lost sense of confidence or hope, that we need to come into communities with some comprehensive change strategy, some comprehensive set of initiatives and programs, and convince people that we actually have the right answer for them, and convince people that in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time, maybe even in 4 years' time, somehow we're going to transform their community, transform their lives. All of a sudden, everything's going to be different for them. And, folks who have lived in poverty, folks who have lost their jobs and where their local economy is hard hit, folks who have been let down, they know that change doesn't come that way. They know that their plight, their individual and their collective plight is not going to change overnight or in 2 or 3 years. They know it's a process. And so I think what engenders belief in communities is the same thing that engenders belief in us as individuals. First, that you have a sense that as you speak, someone else is listening. And that as they are listening, they are seeking to understand what matters to you, what's relevant to you, what's significant in your life. And they're not thinking so much about how to respond yet, but they're just trying to understand. And then they have the capability to reflect back to you their understanding, and that you believe, you gain a sense that it's accurate, or at least accurate enough to keep moving. We gain a sense of belief when we take steps, when we say we want to take a step forward, and we actually take that step with other people, and we realize that we actually accomplished something. Yeah. We didn't change the world. We didn't change unemployment necessarily. We didn't restore a local community's economy. We didn't find jobs for everyone. But that we took a step forward and we basically fulfilled a pledge or a promise we made to ourselves and to one another. People engender a sense of belief, or how belief is engendered in us, is when all of a sudden we're starting to do things together and we fall down. And we recognize that we have a choice now. We can stay down or we can get up and sort of scrape our knee off and exhibit a certain kind of fortitude and courage and wherewithal and know-how that we can keep moving. And when we actually stand up and swipe the dust off our knee, that's another place where we're engendering belief that we actually can keep going. And we have a choice about whether or not we're going to keep going. And then I think what's really important, which I don't think we do nearly enough of in communities, is when we actually achieve a goal, even if it's not the end goal, we have to learn how to celebrate. Yeah. We have to learn to recognize that we've actually achieved something together, and but for our ability to work together, we would not have been able to do it.
Yeah. Just picking up on one of those words, which I know is really important to you, this idea of promise. As I've listened to you over the last few days and as I've watched you work, there seems to be a very important concept to you, that I've noticed that you're very careful that you will not overpromise, that you will promise something that you really can, to your best ability, aim to keep, and then having made that promise, you really go flat out to keep it.
Well, I think in a world where, whether it's here in Australia or in the States or in Canada where we do a lot of work, I think people are wondering how good is our word. And I think people hear promises all day long that are then broken. And I think the currency ultimately that we're working in is a currency of hope. And I think hope is engendered when promises are fulfilled. And so I think where we need to spend our time is thinking about what promises can we make, what pledges to one another can we make when community is a common enterprise, that we can have the likelihood to fulfill. And we're much better off under-promising and fulfilling them than over-promising and falling short in the day and age in which we live. And this work is about relationships.
Yeah.
Relationships are rooted in trust. Trust is rooted in whether or not you fulfilled something you said you would do.
Just a few words, if you could, on the concept of turning outward. I think it's a fantastic concept. I think a lot of people take a hold of it and use it. So I'm very keen that the person who devised the concept sort of can share it with our audience. I think that one of the things that we see in Australia and here today, we have people from the non-government sector, people from neighbourhood and community centres, people from government. All of these people have entered into the institutions that they've entered into wanting to do good, wanting to make change, wanting to make a difference in the world. And yet, so often, the very institutions that want to do good seem to turn in on themselves and become an end to themselves very quickly. So you might like to talk a little bit about turning outward.
Sure. I think, as we've done our work over the years, what we found was that all of us, but particular professionals who do this work, were increasingly saying that they wanted to engage their communities, saying that their work was about community change, saying here in Australia, for instance, that we want to have a tradition of consultation, for instance. And yet what we found as we started to work with these groups was that they weren't turned toward the community at all. Their reference point was their own organization. Their reference point was their own program. Their reference point was their own initiative. Their reference point was how much money they needed to raise. Their reference point was how they could take credit. Their reference point was how they were jockeying for position with their so-called competitors in their community, who one would hope they'd be collaborative with, but we're all competing with one another. And what myself and my colleagues, what we came to understand was that if our reference point is ourselves, how in God's name could we ever have a deep enough understanding of the community that we're trying to serve if we're only looking at ourselves? How is it that we could know what matters to people if we're focused on what matters primarily to ourselves? How could we know what conditions are necessary to create for change? Because it's not simply about creating a new program or initiative. You've got to have the right underlying conditions in a community that can support change and propel it forward. Well, how is it that you could know what those conditions are if you don't have a deep understanding of the communities or communities in which you're operating in? So that was part one. Part two was everyone loves techniques. Everyone loves to learn new skills. But the problem is, if your orientation is turned inward toward yourself, it doesn't matter what skill or technique you've developed, because you're likely to end up coming back to the same place you're already in part because of the direction you're facing, in part because how you interpret things. So even if you go out and do a consultation and you're turned inward, you're likely to keep thinking about, well, what does that mean for me, as opposed to what do I need to know so I can support you, right, and the community. So this is not a skill first and foremost. It's not a technique. It's not something, you know, I hope you may purchase one of my books that talks about this, but you don't need to purchase a book to be able to do this. All you need to do is this. You need to get in a place, in a space where you feel really comfortable, whether it's outside, whether it's in a room, in your office, in your church, wherever it may be. And you simply need to think about, what direction am I facing in? Am I facing outward toward my community, where my community is the reference point for everything I do, and that ultimately drives the strategies I select, the partners I need, the funding I need to do those things? Or is our orientation primarily turned inward toward ourselves, where our conference room, so to speak, becomes our reference point, not the community itself? We've got to get straight with ourselves about which direction we're facing, because it drives our mindset, it drives our attitudes, it drives our behaviors, and ultimately it drives our actions. And you know, all the folks that we work with, they're all incredibly committed to helping communities improve and to strengthen themselves and move people's lives forward. Many folks that you work with, Brian, have committed their entire adult life to this, to these efforts. And so it's not a question of intent. It's a question of what we're doing, and to align our intent with what we're doing on a daily basis.
One of the things that we've experienced in Australia is this pressure to be both efficient and effective. And so we hear we need to be more efficient, and therefore government needs to use procurement processes that are contestable, that's competitive tendering. And then we hear that we need to be more effective, and we can really only be more effective if we work together. And so we now compete collaboratively and collaborate competitively. Right. But it seems to me that in many ways, if you hold tight to that sort of guiding star in terms of turning outward, that some of that becomes relativized, that you can sort of cut through that if you've got that community right at the heart there.
Yeah, there are a few things I was thinking about as you were sort of unfolding this scenario. And one is, if you're turned outward, first of all, what I would say to the NGO community here in Australia is, if you're turned outward and you have a deep understanding of your communities, a deep understanding of the conditions, what matters to people, you are much better prepared to go engage our government officials about what it will take for all of us to win. We all want to win. You know, the folks in government institutions who are writing these sort of qualifications of work, you know, they want to be effective. They want to use government resources well. They want to look good in front of their bosses and in front of the ministers and other folks. So let's keep in mind, first of all, that everyone wants to win. And how is it, and my sense is, if we can turn outward and have that knowledge, we're much more likely to engage in a productive conversation about that. That's one. Two, what I would say is, even when those constraints are placed on our work, you know, it doesn't control whether or not we decide to engage people in our community. It doesn't control whether or not, you know, it's our choice whether or not we have an understanding of the conditions in our community and how fast or slow change can come about. Those constraints don't tell us who are the right partners to work with, who actually do want to turn outward and who do want to collaborate in a genuine sense, not just to get the money, but to make a difference in people's lives. Those are all choices we reserve for ourselves. We don't need permission to act on any of those from anyone else other than the person you see in your mirror every morning when you're getting ready for your day. Those of us in these positions need to figure out whether or not we're willing to step forward. We have to decide among ourselves, within ourselves and between and among ourselves, whether or not we're willing to make ourselves visible. Because in order to make different choices, you've got to make yourself visible, because now you're accountable for what you just chose. But would you rather be visible and accountable and have a chance to succeed, or be invisible, unaccountable, but not affect people's lives? That's the choice for me. It's that basic. It doesn't have to get more sophisticated than that. And so there's a whole collection of choices we still reserve for ourselves, and we've got to claim them, we've got to make them, we've got to be accountable for them. And then when we find ourselves that we have taken the wrong path, because ultimately we will take the wrong path because we don't know everything, we're then accountable for whether or not we're willing to recalibrate our work and make a new set of choices. And I don't want to forfeit those choices to anyone, whether it's a government agency, a faith institution, you know, anyone. Those are choices we need to hold on to and make.
When I saw the work that you've done on the stages of community life, it was worth traveling 25 hours and the cost of the fare and everything, the jet lag, to hear some understanding of the stages of community life. Because I, at more advanced years than yours, had never encountered anything like this, and I think it's so important. You might like to tell us a little bit about the stages of community life and why it's important to understand them.
Yeah, so we were sitting in our office maybe 15, 20 years ago. We were working in about 12 or 15 communities, and we were wondering, why is it that some of these communities were moving forward and others weren't? And why is it that in some communities you could implement the very same initiative as in another community and it worked in one and not in another? I mean, what was going on here? And so we started to plot all this out, and we got some funding from a generous foundation to support this effort. And what we discovered was that communities go through stages, developmental stages, and the question is not whether or not you're in one of the developmental stages, it's which one you're in. And what we also found out is that each stage has fundamentally different implications for the strategies that you would pick for change, and how fast change can come, the pace of it, what expectations you should set, what metrics would best reflect whether or not you're making a certain kind of progress. And here's the other part. This is the part actually I love the most about community rhythms, which is, you know, a lot of times people want to reduce the work that we're all doing to just having more conversations. And those are vitally important, and the work can't take place without them. But there are other pieces to the work, and one of which is we need to understand the underlying conditions of our community, what capacities it has, you know, the layers of leaders in a community, whether or not it has a critical mass of organizations that are turned outward and working with a common sense of purpose, about whether or not there are networks for civic learning and innovation between and among groups, about whether or not there's conscious community conversation as part of these other factors. And each of these stages has a different level of capacity. And if we want to be successful, we need to meet the community where it is, design initiatives that fit the capacity and the sense of public will and the appetite for change, so that we can actually create the right sense of trajectory, path forward, and the right sense of momentum. Here's the danger. The danger is when we disregard what stage of community life our community is in. We so often design initiatives that simply don't fit the context of our community. And then we sort of bemoan the fact that they failed, or they didn't produce the results they were intended to produce, or, you know, we didn't hit our metrics. And look, I think the folks who do this work, you, me, the folks throughout New South Wales and other parts of this country, we could be doing something a lot easier someplace else. We probably could be earning more money someplace else. And so I take it as an article of faith that we want to make a difference in people's lives, and we want to build stronger communities. What the stages of community life does is it increases your likelihood that you can win and that your community can win in trying to move forward. And to me, that's why it's so important.
That's great. Rich, Harwood, it's great to have you in Australia.
It's good to be here.
And we look forward to a lot of work with you into the future.
And I'll be back.